Hi, I'm MTG, and welcome to a deck breakdown for, well, a cute little silly jelly, Gluntch the Bestower, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. But basically, this card, it looks honestly not very good as a commander. Like maybe like a fun politics thing, but oh boy, is this going to be probably a challenge of a deck to play with. The reason why I say that is because at the beginning of your end step, you get to choose a player. They put 2+1/+1 counters on a creature they control. And then you can choose a second player to draw a card. And then you choose a third player to create 2 treasures. And so I think like what I hesitate when I see commanders like this or kind of like group hug effects is that I really don't like giving my opponents resources. It can be tricky because it's like, oh, you're giving them like ways that they could either ramp into answers, or if you're giving them card draw, or you're making their creatures bigger. So I think like there's a pretty high risk to this where it'll be pretty fun when you're at like the 4-player amount, but when it gets down to, I think, like closing out a game, like winning in like a 1v1 situation where you're either going to potentially be giving someone card draw or treasure's really bad. So you might be just building up one creature to be really strong on your opponent's board. And if you don't have a way to like remove a creature or keep yourself protected, it's going to be really hard to, you know, not die because it's like a lot going on to keep track of there. So that's kind of why like I felt drawn to try to put something together for like building this commander. I think when you look at what the color scheme is for this, it's Silencia, so forest and plains. Like a lot of white has good hate bearer effects and good like ghostly prison effects, or things that make it hard for your opponent to hit you and maybe do damage. So when you're looking at that, like I think if you're going to be potentially at risk giving your opponents resources that they can use against you, you're going to want to do a few things. One is have the ability to keep yourself protected and have a way to encourage your opponents to leave you alone and attack others. So that means you might have to lean into politics a bit. So if you're not someone who likes doing politics, like this is probably not the commander for you. Between like making it hard to hit you, and encouraging your opponents not to attack you through politics, you're probably going to want to add in like some sort of like, in the event that people can get around like your tax effects, so like your ghostly prison effects, you're going to want to have a way to like fog out combat or have bodies to protect yourself with, because you are going to probably have a hard time encouraging people to leave you alone if you look really weak as well. Because even though you're giving out resources, that might buy some goodwill with some of your opponents. But I also play with like people and other tables who were running like group hug decks where they were giving resources to other people, but they were also becoming the target because everyone was like, oh wait, group hug decks are actually kind of scary because they try to not look like the bad guy and then they go off and do something crazy. So I have sat at tables where if someone sees like a group hug kind of commander or a theme, that you actually do become the target because they're like, I want you away and I don't want you to give out these resources. So you kind of have to like plan a bit for if you do sit at tables where people are scared of like group hug type of commanders, or figuring out how to keep yourself protected in the later parts of the game where maybe it's just you and your one last opponent and you want to try to win. So I think like a big piece of that is just having bodies out and a way to make chump blockers and stuff. Because if you think about like especially early game, a lot of people are like trying to ramp, and around like turn 3 or 4, if you still haven't had like a creature played or a body or some way to prevent combat damage from happening, you're probably going to be the one that everyone attacks because they see you as a free and easy and open attack. So you have to think of like early bodies that you can put down, early tax effects where people have to pay to attack you, or ways that it like creatures come in tapped, so then maybe that buys you another turn because it doesn't matter if those creatures have haste, they still come in tapped because like authority of the consoles is forcing that. Or having like a way to gain life so that if people are chipping away at you early on in the game, like you're creating a buffer essentially. So just looking into those things there, I think is going to take you a long way. Some cards that I think are going to be good for politics. Root Weaver, I think, is really interesting because it almost has like a heuristic study effect where like if one person takes like the deal to go fetch a land and then give you a land, then someone's like, well, okay, if they're ramping, I want to ramp too. And then maybe they give you a land and decide to take the deal. So what I mean for that, for people who don't know what this card does, is each opponent may search their library for up to 3 basic cards. They each put one of those cards onto the battlefield tapped under your control and the rest onto the battlefield tapped under their control. Then each player who searched their library this way shuffles. So it sounds like a little bad too, because giving your opponents 2 lands there might sound like sketchy, but in one way too, they're giving you one of their lands. So you've taken one of their resources out of their library to help you ramp. And if everyone takes this deal, then you're up 3 lands and then they're up 2. So this card's been really interesting to see because I have seen like people, like the whole table, take the deal on this card because everyone's like, oh, I want to ramp too. So it's kind of interesting. Again, with that like almost heuristic study, like a strategy, right? Where it's like, well, if you're not going to pay your taxes, then I'm not going to pay my taxes. And then if someone else is like, well, if you're going to ramp, I want to ramp. So I think that card's like really interesting when you're doing like some sort of politicking. Another card too that I think is really interesting because it can be either used as a political card or a way to keep yourself protected is your temple is under attack. So you can choose one mode. The first one is pray for protection. So creatures you control gain indestructible until end of turn. And the other one is strike a deal. You and target opponent each draw 2 cards. So I think that's really interesting because if you are, have an arch enemy at the table and you need to draw into answers and you have someone else, you can strike a deal with that person and maybe help them find a board wipe or an answer to whatever the problem is on the board. So I think that card can be really interesting because you can either use it to protect yourself or to maybe make a deal. This one's newer. When I first looked at it, I was like, this card seems really bad, but it's kind of like a perfect fit for like this politics deck. But it's called Tenuous Truce. It's a 2 CMC enchantment. And at the beginning of each enchanted opponent's end step, you and that player draw a card. When you attack an enchanted player or planeswalker they control, or when they attack you, sacrifice Tenuous Truce. So basically, you make a deal with someone that basically if you guys don't attack each other, you're both going to keep drawing cards. So I think that could be like pretty good motivation to basically at least avoid getting hit for a turn or 2 because people do want that card draw. So if you see someone that could be potentially behind and you're like, hey, if we don't attack each other, like we'll draw cards off of each other, I think that's really cool. Of course, like what I mentioned before is you're going to have access to a bunch of like kind of Pillow 40 effects and hate bears. So I think with hate bears, it's a little tricky, right? Because hate bears are known for kind of shutting down like what your opponents want to do and what they're trying to do with their resources or their cards. And so I think like if you're doing a deck like this, you want your opponents to still be able to do what their decks are trying to do. And what I mean by that is you don't want to like add effects where you're negating like activated abilities or you're preventing like ETBs from happening or death triggers from happening because you want people to not target you, right? And so one of the quickest ways that I see people get angry and want to target you is if they can't play the game. If you have an effect on the board that is kind of like a stacks you vibe. So for example, if you're playing Hushbringer, which stops ETBs, and someone's deck is relying on ETBs, whether it's because it's like a graveyard deck or with like recursion value they're trying to get, or some sort of like flicker deck, like people are going to want to target that card and shut it down because it's stopping them from doing what their deck needs to do. So I think you want to stay away from hate bear effects that have that impact, but I think there are some pieces that you can add that would be like kind of like a hate bearer strategy. So things like forcing your opponent's creatures to come in tapped, I think, is a way that can slow down the game, but in a way that can favor you. And I don't think you want to add too many of those effects either, because again, you want people to still attack each other and not you. And the more of these kind of things that you add in, I think is going to draw more negative attention. So with that being said, here are some abilities and cards that I think are going to be really helpful. So stuff like Ghostly Prison, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, where people have to pay 2 if they want to attack you for each creature that's trying to attack you. And then Archangel of Tithes, which I think is an incredible card in a lot of ways, because if it's untapped, it's another Ghostly Prison effect. So instead of paying 2, you have to pay 1. But if you're attacking with Archangel, they have to pay 1 mana in order to block one of your creatures. So it's really good both defensively and offensively. And I love those cards. I throw it in like every white deck I can. Another card that's like more budget friendly, because Archangel of Tithes is pretty expensive. You could try rocking Windborn Muse. Ghostly Prison, but on a body. So creatures can't attack you unless their controller pays 2 for each creature they control that's attacking you. So that's a nice budget-friendly way. One thing I will say is like I try not to put too many Ghostly Prison effects in it, because if you're late game, people more than likely are going to be able to afford to pay the tax for a few creatures, but also doesn't do anything against like drain effects or something like Terror of the Peaks. Like you can still be a target for those kind of effects. So just something to think about there is like these are nice, but you don't want to put too many in your deck, because then it can kind of feel useless, especially late game. I think they're really good effects early game to keep people from hitting you, but kind of, mid to late game is when people have more mana and they're able to like kind of circumvent these effects a bit. Authority of the Consuls is probably one of the best cards you can add, because it's a 1-drop enchantment. Creatures come untapped and you gain life off of that. And it's creatures your opponents control come untapped, so yours don't. And it also like shuts down hasty effects, because like it doesn't matter if a creature has haste, if it comes untapped, it still can't attack. So those can be really helpful too for those kind of like surprise haste decks that might occur. In the event that people can pay their taxes, I think there's some fun things you can do. Almost have like a rule of law effect without feeling oppressive. So I think the card Silent Arbiter is really interesting for this deck, because no more than 1 creature can attack each combat, and then no more than 1 creature can block. So I think that if you happen to be putting a bunch of like big, counters on creatures and they start getting bigger and they go to swing at you, they can pay the Ghostly Prison effect. Well, you can at least limit it to them attacking you with like 1 creature, and then you could chump block or try to, put a body in front to limit the amount of damage they'll be taking. Unless, of course, they have trample, then it's just a sad time. But another thing, too, that you can try to do is use your opponent's forces against them. And I kind of like the concept of like having like an Aikido type style to this deck. So one card I think that would make sense for that, since we don't have access to things like Ink Shield, is going to be Comeuppance. So Comeuppance is prevent all damage that would be dealt to you and a planeswalker you control this turn by sources you don't control. If damage from a creature source is prevented this way, Comeuppance deals that much damage to that creature. If a damage from a non-creature source is prevented this way, Comeuppance deals damage to the source's controller. So if someone's like trying to like crackle with power, like kill you like that way, or some other crazy spell, I think this would just kind of be like a fun like no you or Uno reverse card to just drop. So that's fun. And then the last thing I'll say about like kind of finding ways to protect yourself is going to be like fogs. So I feel like not a lot of people play with fogs, but there are some really, really cool fogs that you can do. One of them is this cute little frog called Spore Frog, and you just sacrifice it and you prevent all damage that would be dealt this turn. Sorry, combat damage. So if things are attacking you, you can sacrifice this and it'll negate the damage. And then another one that I think is actually pretty fun too is Riot Control. You gain 1 life for each creature your opponents control, and then prevent damage that would be dealt to you this turn. So this is a good way to gain a pretty good buffer, but then also just be like, you actually helped me. And then the last one I think is really, really helpful, because it's actually Graveyard Hate and a fog, is Blessed Respite. So if someone attacks you, you can have target opponent shuffle their graveyard into their library. And that can be really helpful if you play with like a lot of people that run like Living Death or some sort of other like graveyard play. So that's just how I see that, as being like a fun little, like graveyard fog kind of stuff. I think that's a pretty cool card. Anyways, the last piece of this has to do with what I mentioned earlier with making bodies and having some way to like chump block them. So I like the idea of including things that are almost like token lords. So Tristani Discordant. Other creatures you control get +1/+1. When it enters the battlefield, create 2/1/1 white soldier creature tokens with lifelink. And the other cool part about this is at the beginning of your end step, each player gains control of all creatures they own. So I like that because I feel like a lot of new Magic cards have kind of leaned into like theft effects. So I really like the idea because I think it's the new Dimir commander. I can't remember his name. But that one's like kind of based on stealing stuff out of your graveyard. And I did something that was kind of funny where they took a card out of my graveyard and then I just took control of it on my next turn with, I think it was like Homeward Path or something like that. And I'm like, oh, thank you. You brought something out of my graveyard for free. So I kind of like the idea of like dropping Tristani after someone steals like maybe an expensive creature I have, and then I just get it back with her. Like, I think that's pretty fun. And it's a good way just to, again, to keep your board somewhat protected from those theft effects. The last one I have here is Maja, Brettagard Protector. And so it's another one with like a lord effect where you have the other creatures you control get +1/+1. And then whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, create a 1/1 white human warrior creature token. And so what I like about this is it boosts maybe some of the other kind of squishy bodies that you have out there. It creates chump blockers, but it boosts like other creatures on your board. So I think if you are trying to do a little bit of like token go wide effects in this, you can set up your board state to drop like a Crater Hoof Behemoth or some sort of like other overrun effect that your opponent might not see coming because they're like, oh, this is just like a group hug a deck. And you're like, psych, I made a huge board state. Now I'm going to hit you in the face. So that's kind of just what I was picturing for this build with this commander overall. Haven't had a chance to play it yet, but I do plan to do a recording with it for an episode of Good Clean Commander. So we'll see how those shenanigans go. And I keep calling this the little jellyfish summon from like Elden Ring. So I might have to put in a few like constellation lands to reference the star mission stuff that was in that. Anyways, I don't know. Sorry, I segued into Elden Ring. So I hope you found this video helpful and interesting. And I would love to hear other cards that you like running. My philosophy on this deck was not to add too many cards that give a lot of things to your opponents, but maybe you leaned into that strategy and did something different. So I'd love to hear your thoughts and how you plan to build your own version of this. So have a good one and thanks for watching. Bye.